Okay, thanks, Tan. Just a disclaimer before I start. These are tips and tricks that have worked for me. Everybody's different and each person has their own individual formula, but I'll just share a few things that have actually worked for me. I will say that in my first few months of my PhD, because of the background that I came from, I actually tried to do as much writing courses as possible. Anything that was offered, I jumped to it. And I think a lot of those courses actually help a lot when you're coming from areas that are not research-based. So I'll take a start. Okay, so historically, manuscripts were a media for documented research, notes, methods and findings, and not necessarily meant for public consumption. But this has changed dramatically over the past centuries, and publishing has become a source of validation and also verification for scientific findings. Manuscripts are an important tool of the trade in academia, and as the saying goes, you either publish or perish. It's important, apart from validation and verification, it's important for your academic reputation or to establish you as an expert in your field. It's also essential for your track record if you're looking at remaining in academia and applying for grant funding so that you can be competitive for grant funding. So I tried to make this interactive, but I don't know how the technology will work. So I'm going to try this. I may have to reshare my screen. So if you go to the barcode that I had on the screen, if you scan it, and you just go to menti.com, okay, I see people are already voting. So most people said that the first scientific journal was published in the 1700s. We have a few from the 1600s and 1800s. Right. And when do you think the first formally established peer review started? 1800s. We have a few more people from the 1900s. Okay. I'm just going to go back to the screen. Okay, am I back to my regular screen?
Yep. It's good.
Right, so the first journal was actually published by the Royal Society of London in 1665, so the 1600s. And there was no peer review and articles were basically decided by the editor. Peer review was formally established in 1894. But prior to this, reviews were anonymous and mainly functioned as defenders of the scientific society's reputation. And if we fast forward to present day, despite many criticisms about the integrity of peer review, the majority of the research committee still believes that it's the best way, the best form of scientific evaluation. And there are various electronic repositories where you can find peer-reviewed manuscripts or peer-reviewed manuscripts. So the main objectives of peer review are to critically evaluate research findings, highlight strengths and weaknesses in the manuscripts, and offer suggestions for improvement. Sorry. And I'm sure most of us are familiar with the peer review process. After you submit your journal, after you submit to the journal, what happens? It first gets a desk review from the editor. If the editor thinks that it's worthwhile to be published in that journal, they'll send it to a few experts in the field who will review that journal and send back comments to the editor. The editor will then review those comments, and then he'll advise whether the manuscript should be published, and then it's edited, etc., and then it appears in the journal. However, there's also the other side of that where your paper gets rejected. So rejection is a normal part of the process, and journals actually aim to reject about 90% of submissions. So don't feel too bad when you get rejected. So you can get a desk reject. So as soon as it gets to the editor, he looks at whether you followed the right format, etc. And if you haven't, it's a desk reject. He'll say that the paper cannot be published in the journal. Or it goes to the reviewers, and the review, and that's actually a good rejection, because when you get that rejection, you get it with feedback, which you can improve the paper and actually send it to another journal. So some of the reasons for rejection would be that you sent it to the wrong journal, or you sent it with the wrong format, or sometimes editors like to look at the word count, and if you're over that word count, then it's just rejected. Sometimes your concepts may not be novel, or the journal may have recently published something similar to what you're proposing to publish. Poor quality, poorly written or explained methods, or your poorly written, poorly explained results, methods, or your discussion. Sometimes it may be because the methods are questionable or the results are questionable. And sometimes it's because some of the journals require you to use published checklists or technical guidelines. So for example, in health economic evaluations, you should use the chair's checklist to ensure that your manuscript is in accordance with what's expected. So we have another one of those. So I'll just share the screen again. Okay, so have you published a peer review article? I just want to see how many people are actually publishing, because I know we have both PhD and master's students. Okay, so some people have published and others haven't. Okay, so we have a mixture of persons. And how many people here who have published have had rejections? So 100% of the persons who have published, 80%, and we're still putting in answers. Okay, so about 83% have had rejections. Okay, so I'll just switch back. Right. So before you actually get your manuscript prepared for submission to a journal, or even before you start writing up that manuscript, there are some essential things that you should do which would make your life easier when you're actually writing up the manuscript or preparing it for submission. So writing detailed protocols helps in systematically conducting your research. It also assists in covering two major sections of your manuscript, your introduction and your methods. Secondly, early in the process, you need to decide who your audience will be. And this assists with the language that you use to write the manuscript, the approach or the tone that you take in terms of the manuscript. So for health economists, if you're writing in an economics journal, or if you're writing in a disease-specific journal or clinical journal, the language can be different. Another thing that you really need to do is to research the possible journals and review the manuscript guidelines. So what I usually do, I go and I look at the top 10 journals in whatever specific area that I'm going to submit the manuscript in. And I'll probably aim for the first 2 journals in terms of what guidelines they're using. So whilst I'm writing my manuscript, I'm already using the guidelines that the journal recommends, especially things like word count, etc. You need to ensure that your analysis is meticulous, so you don't get questioned in terms of your manuscript by reviewers. Authorship should be settled at that point in time, who your co-authors are going to be. It's always good to get internal review and also external review from your peers. So for example, you're working in a team and you're very familiar with whatever research that you're doing, but there are also persons within your department outside of your immediate team who may not necessarily know what you're doing. So it's always good to let them read your work so you can get some feedback, because sometimes you may, because you're so familiar with the topic or your supervisor is so familiar with the topic, a lot of mistakes, or sometimes the language may not be simple enough for somebody who is not doing the research with you to understand. So getting that external or internal feedback within your department is always good, and from persons who are not directly involved in your research. And it's always good before you start writing up to discuss with your co-authors or your team or your supervisors the approach to how you're going to set your results. Which results are you going to present, and how are you going to approach the discussion? So when you really get down to your manuscript, you have all of that covered and you're just going to sit and write. So tips for writing your manuscript. The first thing that you do is, after you've reviewed your initial results, what is the most important thing about those results? What is your take-home message? So the importance, the take-home message is really the importance of your research in a few sentences. So if you're going to describe it, to pitch it to, say, somebody from industry and you want to get some more funding for your research, what is the most important thing about your research? What story do my results tell? Who needs to know about my results? And why do you need to know about my results? And this take-home message will need to infiltrate through every section of your manuscript. Okay, so there's another one. I don't remember what that one is, but let's see. Okay, we can skip that one because we've spoken about that. And this one was answered. Okay, we'll just go back to the presentation. Right, so my approach to doing my manuscripts is actually working backwards. And I find that has worked really well for me, because your results are what really tell the story of what you're going to put in your manuscript. So once you organize your results properly and you decide what's important about your results, then the rest of your manuscript will flow. So you decide what items you're going to include in your results. And remember, you would have discussed that with your co-authors, your team, your supervisor. Okay, so which results will you display? What kind of figures and tables will be appropriate? Which results, what's the order of your results, which ones you show first, second, and of course you can't display everything. Are there any important results that you need to include as supplements? Do the results that you've chosen align to your take-home message? And as I mentioned before, discuss and agree with your team before investing time on the figures and tables, because these take a lot of time, and if you have to keep redoing them, it's really not value for money. So writing your results, you ensure titles for figures and tables are informative and not descriptive. You really don't need to describe what you have in your table. So you have very simple legends and titles for your tables. You also need clear legends and footnotes. Divide your results into key subsections. If you lump everything together, people might get lost, so you can divide it into key subsections. So if you're doing a study, say about a cohort, you can have one section about your the descriptive characteristics of your cohort. Then you go into different sections based on the main results that you've identified. Usually when you identify those subsections, then you put some dot points or an outline under each section, so you know exactly what you're going to be putting there, and then you just elaborate when you start writing. Try to be succinct and provide an overall picture, and don't get too lost in the detail, because sometimes it can get very confusing for the reader. Be consistent with your tense throughout the results. So if you're going to be using past tense, you stick to past tense, or if you're going to be using present tense, you stick to present tense. Use plain, simple English with short sentences. Long sentences sometimes can be very confusing. By the time you get to the end of the sentence, you've forgotten what the beginning of the sentence was about. And always keep your take-home message in mind when you're elaborating your results, especially if you're trying to be succinct with it. With your discussion, usually your discussion, it has three main parts. So an introduction paragraph, the body of your discussion, and then a closing paragraph. So in your introduction paragraph, you remind your readers of your main hypothesis or the aims of your study. And with that, you give them the most important findings that go with that, the aim of your research. So restatement or review of the most important findings, generally in the order of significance. And in the last sentence, you pitch the emphasis, you emphasize on the novelty or importance of the results that you just found. In the body of the discussion, you critically discuss or explain the main findings, and of course, supported by references to relevant literature. Each paragraph should evaluate one key aspect of the results, and it should address the implications of your results and also the relevance to practice. And that really applies to if you're working in a disease-specific area, or if you're submitting your journal to a clinically based journal. The last paragraph of the body should identify the strengths and limitations of your study and how you think that has affected the outcomes of your study. And lastly, a closing paragraph, which looks at recommendations for future research and practical applications in the broader context of the results. So taking all of your results together, which is a sentence that I like to use very often, taking this together, this signifies X, Y, and Z for clinical practice or whatever. And it should always link to your take-home message. So most people get writer's block when they're writing their discussion. Just a few tips on how to make your writing flow. So you move from general information to more specific information. You usually put old concepts before new concepts. So let's say you finished off an old concept in the first sentence, you finished off a concept in the first sentence of your discussion. You usually you start off the second sentence with that old concept and then move into the new concept, introduce the new concept. Usually make a link to the preceding sentence within the first 7 to 9 words of your sentence. So the subject of that sentence should link to the previous sentence that you wrote. And include the subject of the sentence and the verb in the first 7 to 9 words of your sentence. And there's an example. I think Tan may share the slides with you afterwards, so you can have a look at the example. So your method section, the methods help readers understand the process of how you obtain your results. It also provides credibility to the process, and it also allows persons to reproduce whatever you've done. For the method section, again, simple language is important, and you use the passive voice. So you don't say, we use descriptive statistics to whatever. You would say descriptive statistics were used to ... It's always good to use the passive voice. Similar to your results section, what you can probably do after you've written your results, you can use those same subsections to elaborate your methods. You can cite methods that have previously been published. There's no reason for you to go in full detail, but for methods that are novel or new methods, you should describe that in detail. One of the things that I usually do, especially if it's something new that I'm introducing in the methods, I would make use of my supplement, because you usually have word counts and you have to limit your word count, especially if you write lengthy discussions or lengthy introductions. I usually put a lot of detail in terms of methods in a supplement. Reflect on your results, especially figures and tables, and ensure that methods related to those are addressed in your methods section. And always ensure that processes related to your main results or take-home messages are elaborated. So the introduction, the elements of your introduction, usually 5 elements, a general introduction, then you have your specific introduction, your research gap, your study aim, and what's the value added of doing that, actually conducting that research. Next, your abstract and title. Your abstract and title are the first point of contact with your manuscript. It's sort of like the marketing section of your manuscript, and it's usually used to decide on desk rejects. Try to use simple language so it appeals to experts, but it also appeals to others who are not necessarily interested in the topic or have experience in the topic, because journals usually get a wide range of reviewers, and sometimes the reviewer may not be, say, for disease-specific journals, for disease-specific manuscripts. The person may be an expert in PROMs, patient-reported outcomes, but they may not necessarily be an expert in, say, hypertension. So keep the language simple enough so that everybody can understand it, but you bringing across the message that you actually want to bring across. You should try to keep your title very short and catchy. Sometimes I read manuscripts and the titles are like a paragraph long. And then I get lost halfway in reading the title. So try to keep your title catchy so that it catches the editor's eyes, and keep it short or succinct. In your abstract, the main elements of your abstract, the main purpose of the study and its scope, essential but brief information about the methods, because you're going to describe that in detail in your methods section. So anything that you think would be novel or important in terms of when you get to your results, you should include that in your methods in your abstract. The main results, that's the results related to your take-home message again, the results that will actually sell the manuscript, and then a statement of conclusion, which may include implications or recommendations for future research. Then you're preparing and submitting your final manuscript. So part of that process is the feedback process. And I know sometimes feedback can hurt because not everybody gives feedback in a pleasant manner. But feedback is not about you, it's about the manuscript. Never take feedback personally, because feedback always improves what you're going to be sending to the journal. And you rather get good feedback before you send it to the journal than getting the journal reviewers or the editor to desk reject your manuscript. If your co-authors are confused about something in your manuscript, the reviewers will definitely be confused too, because they're closer to it than the actual reviewers who will be going through it. It's important to address all comments provided by your co-authors. And also remember that recommendations should improve the manuscript, and not all need to be taken on board. Sometimes you get a lot of recommendations from your co-authors, and it really doesn't change the quality or content of the manuscript. And you may spend lots of time addressing those in the manuscript. And to be honest, sometimes it's a waste of time. So you choose recommendations that will improve your manuscript. The other thing that I noticed when I started my PhD was that everybody has a different writing style. And a writing style doesn't mean, if your writing style is not similar to, say, that of your primary supervisor, it doesn't mean that the way you're writing is wrong. It just means that everybody writes differently or expresses themselves differently. The only thing I would say is to take note of your grammar and take note of grammar and spelling suggestions. Those are very important. You don't want to send a manuscript to a journal with spelling errors. That is just not acceptable. Submitting your manuscript. So everyone has to submit a cover letter. Sometimes people don't really spend time on the cover letter and don't really realize how important it is. Just like your abstract, your cover letter is one of the key selling points for your manuscript. So in terms of your cover letter, ensure that it has your take-home message again, why your research is important, why it should be published, and what are the implications in your field of research. Ensure that you use checklists. So if it's the consort checklist or the chair's checklist that the journal requires, ensure that you've applied that checklist and you've included it in your submission. Get all your documents finalized and your information ready for the upload process, but make sure you check the journal guidelines again, so you don't have the journal sending you an email telling you that you forgot to do this or you forgot to do that. And another important thing is always recommend reviewers when the journal asks. It usually gets your paper reviewed quite quickly because you're making recommendations for persons and they don't have to actually go looking for persons. So responding to reviewers, just to say the peer review process is not perfect. As I mentioned before, feedback is not about you, it's about the manuscript. You sometimes may get some biased reviewers because maybe they've published similar papers to you or that sort of thing. So the peer review process is really not perfect, but it's the best that we have. Be calm when you're responding to reviewers. The best thing is to, when you get that paper back from the journal, put it aside for a week, calm your nerves, and then pick it up the following week to respond to the reviewers. And that's just based on my experience. You get really upset when you look at some of the comments. It's like, oh no, this is obvious. Why are they asking me this? But just put it aside for a week or a few days and go back to it when you're calmer. It's important to always respond to all comments in detail, quote the changes that you've made or track the changes in the manuscript, and always put in the line numbers where you've made the changes. Make it as easy as possible for the reviewers so they don't have to be going back and forth. And it's really irritating when you get a manuscript to review and you have to be going through different documents to see exactly where the changes were made, etc. So just make sure you make it as easy as possible for the review. And that's my perspective as a reviewer and not necessarily the person writing the manuscript. If it's recommended and not going to hurt the manuscript, just accept the suggestion. Sometimes reviewers make suggestions and it's really just doesn't make sense for you to do it. But in the case of the reviewer, always keep the reviewer happy. If it's not going to hurt your manuscript, just accept the suggestion. And if you're not going to accept a recommendation provided by a reviewer, make sure you have valid reasoning for that. Provide a good argument why you're not going to change something or why you think it's not appropriate to go in the direction that the reviewer is suggesting. And then we just wait for a response from the journal. That can be from 6 weeks to a year, depending on the journal that you've submitted to. And it can be sometimes the patient's levels are very low, but we don't have an option but to wait. I just thought I would share some resources that I've used. So this book, Writing Scientific Research Articles, it's a really, really good book. It goes through each section of your manuscript and gives you some really good tips on how to write the manuscript so everything flows easily. The Salus Institute, I don't know if you're familiar with the Salus Institute, but that was one of the trainings I did. And they have a course called Writing Your Research in 3 weeks, I think. And that course was really good. It's also the journal guidelines for authors. They give a lot of details, so it's always good to go through that in detail as well. And some of them actually give you writing tips or other resources that you can use for your manuscripts. And I also found this really good article. It's not very long, but what I like about it is that it has a checklist. So basically what they're explaining in that article is that you need to write your paper to suit different types of reviewers. So they're giving you a checklist with each of the different types of reviewers that who may get to review your manuscript. And they're giving you a checklist so you can look to make sure that you include certain things in your manuscript. So you're covering all the different types of reviewers that you may meet, that your manuscript may meet. So basically it looks at right with the reviewers in mind, why you got a rejection and how to avoid the next. So I really recommend that article. It's not very long, but it's very helpful. You don't even have to read the article, you just have to look at the checklists. And now I can take some questions and comments if anybody has any questions or comments.
Thank you, Ingrid. Yeah, really useful tips. I'm one of those that's had a publication already, but I think these will help make it easier and faster. I think, and probably make it probably improve the flow. So, were there any questions from the floor or even from the chat? I'll just have a look. Just a comment from Gan. Any questions? Just Renee?
Yeah, thanks so much, Ingrid. That's really helpful. Renee here from University of Melbourne. I have had articles accepted but also rejected. And one of my issues is often when I get a review, I feel that I need to address all of the comments and make changes. Even sometimes if I disagree and I feel that it might hurt the manuscript to make those changes, I really sometimes struggle to respond in a way where I feel like I would like to not include it. And I wonder if you have any suggestions on maybe how to be a bit stronger on pushing back in a way that still works with the journal systems.
Yeah, so I did have an experience like that where one of the journals came back to me and wanted me to do a completely new analysis and take a completely new approach to doing to my analysis. So in that case, what I did, I actually did the analysis in the approach with the approach that they recommended. And then based on the results that I got, I was like, okay, the results are the same. There's no difference. There's no value added. So I'm not going to accept, I'm not going to change my results based on what you recommended. So I think the trick to it is really, really defending what you're doing. So if you feel really strongly about it, you just give proper validation why you don't think you should change the approach that you're taking. But before you do that, one thing that I think is of value, usually when I write my responses to the journals, I usually give it to one of my colleagues to read, or to read the manuscript and look at the comments that I've made. And sometimes that can help to help you decide on whether you should take the approach that the reviewer is mentioning, or just decide that you're not going to do it this way because whatever explanation you've given is quite valid and your analysis is robust and whatever. But it's always good to consult with peers who are not involved in your research when you're responding to comments, because they can give you really good feedback as to whether what you're saying is justified or not. So that would probably be my approach, but every situation is different. And sometimes some of the reviewers can really be very, can I use the word petty? But yes, so yeah. That would be my response to you, Renee.
Thank you, Ingrid. I've got a question from her.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, thank you, Tan. Thank you, Ingrid. It is very great presentation. So I just got comment. So maybe just want to add to your point, Ingrid, about responding to reviewer in an effective way. So I agree with your point, all the point that you raised, but I get that also it could be good for you to have some backup, like, you know, if you try to push back the suggestion from the reviewers, not just, you know, you have to defend your analysis or your whatever your case study is, you know, a robust and whatever, but you could also have some backup with reference and citation somewhere that you could actually draw on those that you can cite. I think I used to do that before in a field of my paper when they had any sort of suggestion that is not relevant or is quite, you know, is not so, you change the direction of your research or so, you could actually push it back in a polite way. I say, like you do all of the other suggestions, you try to make them pleased with all other suggestions, but then leave the last one whatsoever that you say that you think that it's not, might not be good or you know, not be relevant or so whatever, but then you need to have some backup for that why you don't do that. So it's rationale and backup would be good. I guess that my comment is about when you're saying that we should use passive voice. I think this is also like a mixed view about using passive voice or active voice. Some people actually like to have like a stronger you know, voice, so they want to use active voice instead of, you know, being passive, but it depends as well. I like, you know, you could use both, like mix of, like, let's say in your paper, in your method, you could say, okay, this paper, whatever this analysis is going to be, a TTIT or descriptive analysis were used to demonstrate blah, blah, blah. Or the other way, you could use like, you know, we use this to explore association between X and Y, which is, you know, okay too, because I know, you know, there's some people have different views on this, and some people have quite strong view on, okay, I like you see this, you know, just write in a passive way. It's just, just show that you have a strong opinion, whatever. So this is just neutral. I think. I guess for introduction, and I agree that, you know, it's very important that in the first paragraph you have to nail down the you know, the important or significant of your study. I think a lot of people don't have, like reviewer don't have time to go through the whole thing until, you know, it's too late, too lower. They would just focus on the first paragraph, and then if it's interested to them, they would read more. Otherwise, you know, if not, sometimes it just you lose some point. So really nail down in the first paragraph why this is important, why you do it now, why we should look into, you know, why we should accept your paper. So this is just, you know, some comment from me. So thank you very much, Ingrid. Yeah. Very helpful tip.
Yes, in terms of the passive and active voice, yes, I agree with you totally. It depends on what journal you're submitting your article to. In terms of the introduction, one other point on the introduction, some people have introductions that are 2 and 3 pages. I think the key to your paper is to be really succinct in your introduction. Make your introduction maybe 4 paragraphs long. So in that way, people don't have to read 3 pages before they actually get the point of your research. The most important part of your manuscript, your results and your discussion, because that's where you're going to defend what you've done in your methods and why it's important that you use that method, etc. So that's another key point. In terms of your introduction, keep it as short as possible and save the words for maybe your results and your discussion section.
Thank you, Ingrid. I guess some reflections are, I mean, both as a, you know, as an author and peer reviewer, it's the passive active voice is really interesting discussion. I'm not sure what your experiences are, all those in the room, but I've found that a lot of the passive voice is generally used in most of the sections except the discussion. I think the discussion offers probably the opportunity to use the active voice a bit more strongly there. Yeah, so just curious to know your experience, Ingrid, and others in the room.
I'll give the opportunity to others in the room or online, and then I can probably comment.
Anyone in the room? Clara?
No one in the room?
Sorry, it's probably a bit, so Clara's just asked, saying that in the past she's written passive voice usually. Yeah.
Like, or something. For me, it's much easier to write in passive voice because that's how I know. I can see for a non-native English speaker sometimes to change content from whatever it is that we are reading.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So just reflections of it, and for the audience in the virtual, Clara's used to sort of that passive voice, but there is a little bit more of a trend towards a bit more active voice in the papers. Ingrid?
Yeah, I tend to use passive voice mostly for my methods. When I get to the discussion, I definitely use the active voice because your discussion is actually sort of like marketing the paper. So yeah, I use both active and passive in the discussion.